Something very few people are telling you plainly, why or so has a maybe in while the cable news networks are busy arguing about political theater, is that what's unfolding right now in Ukraine is not just a regional war. It is the live demonstration of a new global military order, and the United States, whether Washington admits it or not, is being forced to watch and reckon with what that means. Russia has now deployed a layered, high-precision strike architecture inside the Ukrainian theater that is unlike anything we've seen normalized in modern warfare. We're talking about laser-guided Krasnopol M2 artillery shells paired with drone spotters, Iskander-M hypersonic ballistic missiles, Caliber cruise missiles, Shahed kamikaze drones, and perhaps most alarmingly, the Oreshnik, an intermediate-range ballistic missile that travels at 13,000 kilometers per hour and can mount both single or multiple conventional and nuclear warheads. These are not isolated weapons. They are pieces of an integrated system, so a doctrine. And right now, Ukraine is the testing ground where Russia is refining it in real time against real targets with real consequences. And while the diplomats sip coffee in Abu Dhabi and Geneva, the missiles keep flying. That is the story. That is what you need to understand. Because here's the thing about what Russia is doing that the mainstream press glosses over in favor of casualty counts and dramatic video footage. Is this isn't just about destroying cities or terrorizing civilians, though that is absolutely happening. Russia's decoupling of firepower from maneuver in Ukraine signals a dangerous shift toward punitive algorithmic warfare. A kind of warfare where you don't need to physically occupy territory to degrade your enemy's will and capacity to fight. You simply reach out and destroy the infrastructure that makes modern life possible. And once you understand that framing, everything else starts to make terrible, coherent sense. Let's start with the precision systems themselves, because this is where the story gets genuinely serious and where most people's understanding stops at the surface. Russia confirmed the delivery of new batches of Krasnopol M2 laser-guided artillery shells from Rostec's high precision systems, and what this signals is not a headline. It is a strategic shift. The Krasnopol M2 is a 152mm round that homes in on a laser-designated target in the terminal phase of its flight. It doesn't rely on GPS. It doesn't care about satellite jamming. Against a peer adversary under heavy electronic warfare, the M2's main advantage is its independence from GNSS in the terminal phase. That matters enormously in a conflict where both sides are aggressively jamming each other's navigation systems. The United States gave Ukraine the M982 Excalibur, a brilliant GPS-guided shell, and reports throughout 2024 and 2025 described degraded performance for GPS-guided rounds like M982 Excalibur under Russian jamming. Russia looked at that vulnerability and responded with a system designed to bypass it entirely. That's not luck. That's adaptive, intelligent military engineering. Now, you might ask, if these rounds are so effective, why haven't they already decided the war? And this is where it becomes genuinely interesting, because reality is always more complicated than the press release. Ukrainian electronic warfare jamming is responsible for 75 to 80% of Krasnopol guidance system failures or guidance system instability. Ukrainian forces are not just sitting there absorbing punishments. They are fighting back in the electromagnetic spectrum with extraordinary sophistication. Krasnopol crews cannot conduct reconnaissance on the ground under threat of Ukrainian drone strikes, and drone spotting for Krasnopol strikes is also ineffective and can contribute to premature detonation. So you have this fascinating, brutal back and forth happening at the level of technology and tactics, each side probing for the other's weakness, adapting, counter-adapting in a cycle that consumes men and machines at a staggering rate. But Russia isn't relying on one system. That's the critical point. Strategically, these deliveries fit a broader Russian shift toward precision artillery inside a fires-dominant doctrine adapted to dense electronic warfare and pervasive surveillance. What that means in plain language is that Moscow is building a system of systems where where drones provide the eyes, laser-guided shells provide the close-range precision, and ballistic missiles provide the deep strike capability. Russia has been expanding and scaling drone production and adaptation to support its ongoing efforts to generate battlefield air interdiction effects across the front line, specifically targeting logistics, the roads, railways, and bridges that keep Ukrainian forces supplied and able to move. So still can be and you take away a military's legs, its ability to resupply and reposition, and you don't need to win in a straight fight. You can just wait. And above all of this sits the ballistic missile layer. and C are all by is the Daisy, the one that ought to make every serious analyst in Washington sit down and think very carefully. Russia uses a mix of expensive, high precision, and legacy missiles for daily pressure on Ukraine. Cirstances Aitori so why, as ballistic missiles remain the deadliest, Ukraine should bolster its high-speed defenses to protect infrastructure and shape negotiations. That assessment from CSIS is measured and careful, as think tank language always is, but let's translate it into what it actually means on the ground. Russia fired around 450 drones and 70 missiles at Ukraine overnight in one of the largest attacks of the entire war. And it did this the night before peace talks. Think about that timing. Not an accident. A message delivered in fire and smoke to anyone sitting at the negotiating table, and that message was punctuated earlier in January of 2026 with something that truly crossed a threshold. Both Ukrainian and Russian officials confirmed that Russia launched an Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile strike against Lviv on the evening of January 8th and 9th, 2026. It was only the second time the Russians had employed this missile during the war. Now, Lviv is in western Ukraine. It is far from the front lines. It sits near the Polish border. When Russia fires an Oreshnik at Lviv, it is not trying to achieve a tactical military objective in any traditional sense. A central reason for the deployment of the Russian Oreshnik to Belarus and its use against a civilian infrastructure target in Lviv is to demonstrate that Russia remains a nuclear-armed world power. In this guise, it is a psychological weapon, an instrument of Putin's cognitive war against Ukraine and the West. This is where you need to slow down and really absorb what's being said, because the framing matters enormously. The Oreshnik is not simply a new weapon. It is a signal. It is Russia saying in the loudest possible military language that there is no sanctuary, that geography offers no protection, and that the escalation ladder has more rungs than the West has been willing to acknowledge. The EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas said the strike shows that Putin doesn't want peace, and that Russia's reply to diplomacy is more missiles and destruction. And she's right about the pattern, even if the deeper motivations require more unpacking than a tweet can provide. Because here's what Alex Craner would tell you, and and what I want you to really sit with, the question is never just what a weapon system can do physically. The question is always what it is meant to communicate and to whom. Russia deploying the Oreshnik during active peace talks is not irrational. It is, in a chilling way, perfectly rational within its own strategic logic. Moscow does not want a peace deal that leaves Ukraine in NATO's orbit, with Western military hubs on its border, with European security guarantees underwritten by American power. Russian President Vladimir Putin has ruled out any deployment of troops from NATO countries on Ukrainian soil, and every escalation is designed to remind Europe and Washington that the cost of pushing that boundary is something no Western electorate is prepared to pay. Look at the diplomatic picture as it stands right now in April 2026, and you'll see exactly this dynamic playing out in slow motion. 3 rounds of talks between US, Ukrainian, and Russian officials held in the United Arab Emirates and Switzerland in late January and February 2026 did not achieve a breakthrough. A 28-point peace plan was circulated, but many of the proposals prompted concern among Ukraine and its European allies that the plan was overly favorable to Russia and reiterated Russia's maximalist demands for resolving the conflict, including the ceding of territory. Meanwhile, Russia remains confident it can achieve its goals through military means, while Ukraine relies on its capacity to endure. So, and capacity to endure is exactly what the precision strike campaign is designed to erode. This is the brutal arithmetic of what Russia is doing. It is not trying to win a traditional ground war in the way we think about armies seizing territory. It is running a sustained algorithmic degradation campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure, its logistics, its industrial base, and ultimately its population's will to keep fighting. Russian forces often launch no or few missiles for multiple days in a row before launching strike packages with a significant quantity of missiles, likely stockpiling their missiles between strike series in order to launch larger strike packages to maximize damage. This is not random. This is an operational rhythm deliberately calibrated for maximum disruption. Consider what this means for ordinary Ukrainian civilians living through a winter that was, by all accounts, one of the coldest in years. The aerial assault targeted at least 5 regions and focused on Ukraine's power grid as part of Moscow's campaign to deny civilians electricity, heating, and running water during the coldest winter in years. Zelensky called it exactly what it is, taking a weight ball, that's not cool, in by source of 1 day in eyes are A's, so taking advantage advantage of the coldest days of winter to terrorize people. When you hear language like precision strike system, when you hear analysts talk about CEP measurements and terminal guidance and standoff range, never let that clinical language obscure what it means in human terms. It means a 52-year-old woman named Olena Karpenko standing in the cold, watching a man burn to death in a neighboring apartment and carrying that scream in her memory for the rest of her life. Karpenko said they heard a sudden explosion at the nearby thermal power plant, followed by a stronger blast, and she watched how the apartment was burning. That is the human reality behind the weapons briefings. And yet, and so is niet die systeem creëren en die is niet die ICTs. And this is the part that almost nobody in mainstream American media wants to sit with. Ukraine has not been passive. It has been striking back with remarkable ingenuity and reach. In February 2026, Ukrainian forces struck something that sent a genuine shockwave through Russian military circles. On the night of February 25, a Ukrainian Flamingo cruise missile struck production workshop number 22 of the Votkinsk plant, the facility in Udmurtia where Russia produces its Iskander ballistic missiles, its Oreshnik IRBMs, and its nuclear-capable intercontinental missiles. Let that sink in for a moment. Ukraine hit the factory that makes the weapons Russia is using to bomb Ukraine. A massive hole in the roof, measuring approximately 30 by 25 meters, was caused by concrete structures being blown outward from inside as a result of the detonation of a 1-ton warhead. This was not a symbolic strike. So this was a deep, precise hit on Russia's most sensitive military-industrial infrastructure with a domestic Ukrainian cruise missile deep inside Russian territory. This kind of strike capability Ukraine developing its own long-range precision weapons while simultaneously building drone armies and fighting a grinding ground war tells you something about this conflict that the casualty-focused media coverage consistently misses. This war has become a crucible for the next generation of warfare, and both sides are graduating from it with lessons that will reshape how every military on Earth thinks about conflict for the next 50 years. The drone, the guided shell, the loitering munition, the long-range cruise missile, the hypersonic ballistic, and these systems are no longer theoretical or experimental. They are being stress-tested and refined in real time in real conditions against real countermeasures. For the American audience thinking about what this means for their country, for their security, for the broader global order, the implications cut very deep. The United States entered this conflict with a set of assumptions about escalation management, about the sanctity of certain red lines, about Russia's actual military capability versus its perceived capability. Many of those assumptions have been revised, some of them dramatically. A major reason for the limited number of ATACMS given to Ukraine is that US officials have expressed concern about their own stockpiles. Read that again. The United States of America, US American, the world's preeminent military power, what is us in Benser Tower has been rationing one of its key battlefield munitions because it doesn't have enough of them in reserve. That is not a minor footnote. That is a profound statement about the state of American military readiness for sustained high-intensity industrial warfare. Meanwhile, Russia has been on a war economy footing for years now, with its defense industries running multiple shifts, churning out artillery shells, drones, and guided weapons at a pace that has genuinely surprised Western analysts. Russia's recent missile strikes indicate a transition in strategy and doctrine, where industrial capacity plays a growing role in determining battlefield dynamics. Massed salvos have given way to a more flexible strike schedule, necessitating an adaptive defensive strategy. Industrial capacity. That phrase should ring alarm bells in Washington because it points to something that goes far beyond Ukraine. This is in the repiles, it points to the question of whether the West's defense industrial base, hollowed out by decades of outsourcing, cost-cutting, and the assumption that the post-Cold War peace dividend would last forever, is prepared for the kind of sustained peer competition that the next decade is almost certainly going to demand. And then there is the geopolitical chessboard around all of this, which grows more complex by the month. A key factor sustaining Kiev's confidence is the support provided by European countries, both military and financial, totaling $90 billion for 2026 and 2027. Europe has woken up to the threat in a way that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. The UK and France said they will establish military hubs across Ukraine and build protected facilities for weapons and military military equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs. This is a major strategic commitment, but it comes with its own complications because Russia has made clear with one so was so saying with missiles and with words that Western military presence on Ukrainian soil is something it considers a red line. Following the coalition of the Willing Summit, Russia conducted a strike with the intermediate-range ballistic missile Oreshnik in the Lviv region near the border with Poland. By escalating the situation, Russia seeks to pressure European countries to reduce support for Ukraine and to influence Trump to exert greater pressure on Kyiv. This is the world as it actually is in the spring of 2026, not the world of clean narratives, of good guys and bad guys, of simple victories and defeats. It is a world of hard, grinding, technological, industrial, and geopolitical competition where the deployment of a laser-guided artillery shell is simultaneously a tactical decision, a strategic statement, and a data point in a global argument about what power means, who holds it, and what they are willing to do with it. Russia is not losing this war on the information battlefield, and it is not losing it in the electromagnetic spectrum and whatever one thinks of its moral position, which is indefensible by any reasonable standard. Its military machine has proven more resilient, more adaptive, and more capable of sustaining high-intensity operations than the Western consensus predicted in February 2022. What happens next depends on factors that remain genuinely uncertain: the outcome of negotiations, the durability of European commitment, the direction of American policy under Trump, the pace of Russian production, the depth of Ukrainian endurance. Now, the prospects for a comprehensive and sustainable peace in Ukraine in the near term remain limited, with neither side having achieved its strategic objectives and the conflict having entered a phase of protracted confrontation. That assessment may be dry and diplomatic in tone, but it contains within it a truth that everyone watching this conflict needs to hold on to. This is not ending quickly, it is not ending cleanly, and the weapons being used, refined, and proliferated through this conflict will define the security environment that your children and grandchildren will inherit. Paying attention to this, really paying attention not just to the headlines, but to the doctrine, the technology, the economics, and the geopolitics is not optional for anyone who wants to understand the world they actually live in.